President Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet reshuffle has been topical since his re-election at the ANC's National Elective Conference. That was in December last year. But party officials have deflected questions on a reshuffle, saying it will happen once the president decides to do so. But what exactly informs Ramaphosa's changes to the cabinet? Is it performance-based or loyalty and slate support-based? Let's unpack this. We chat to Professor Alex van den Heever, who is with the Wits School of Governance, and he joins us on the line this morning. Prof, great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us so early on a Sunday morning. We've been building up to a reshuffle, haven't we? We talked about it at the elective conference in December. Then we thought it might happen before the State of the Nation address, maybe before the finance minister's budget speech last week, and yet here we are still waiting.
Yes, it's concerning because the cabinet reshuffle is very fundamental to achieving any kind of serious objective by government between now and the elections. And the cabinet ministers have an enormous amount of power, which means that they influence the trajectory of the departments that they are responsible, the functions and the departments they're responsible for overseeing. And that power can be abused and misused. So in the choice of the cabinet, you've got to basically remove the people who are tainted and problematic, remove the people who are incompetent, put people in who can actually drive things forward. And I think that the hesitation and the delay is extremely problematic and suggests that there are potentially fundamental problems in making these changes.
And perhaps points to the president's indecision yet again. Prof, you talk about people who are tainted, problematic, possibly corrupt, being part of this cabinet reshuffle. Who stands out for you?
Well, I won't identify individuals because I think that's problematic. I think there's a lot of information out there. The Zondo Commission itself reflected on a number of cabinet ministers. It was interesting that in De Ruyter's interview, he mentioned certain people, and in his conversation with a key sort of principal, they said, oh, well, it was bound to come out sometime. People in cabinet know who the dodgy ministers are. There's no way the president doesn't know. So you can't have people like that actually running our country. We can't have them in these crucial departments. So we've got a failure across a number of very, very strategic sectors in South Africa, which impact on South Africa's economic growth and security. And all of those functions at this point in time are being handled very, very poorly. And the question is whether it is incompetence or corruption or both. And it is most probably both. And I think that we now need a reset. And if we have an approach to a cabinet reshuffle, which is just to kind of add ministers on and centralize some sort of control within the presidency as a solution to not actually making the hard choices, then I think we're not going to see very significant progress on many of these key functions in government until the next elections.
You talk about adding ministers on. Of course, the announcement the president made at the State of the Nation address around the appointment of an electricity minister comes to mind.
Yeah, it's classic indecision. I mean, instead of making hard choices, such as replacing poor ministers that can't perform and can't cooperate, you just put somebody in charge of them who is now supposed to project manage and coordinate them. Well, that isn't what's supposed to happen at the executive level of government. There are enough people within the machinery of government to do these things effectively and to de-silo where required. That's not the solution, because in many cases, the cabinet ministers themselves are not project managers. They're not people who are astute managers. They're not necessarily technical experts in the key areas. You want people who are able to create a bridge between the actual administration of government and public functions and society. That's really what the executive has to be. The coordination of strategic policy, not day-to-day management. And what it appears is that there is an attempt to have ministers directly get involved in executive management of public entities and public functions in government. And that has been a failure over the last 25 years in the way this government has performed. That kind of interference has led to systemic corruption, incompetence, and problematic interference, as well as instability at the leadership level of public administrations. So you don't try and get executives, members of the executive of government, to do things they can't do. This is really where I think some hard choices need to be made, and I don't think that he's going to make the hard choices that are necessary to correct these things. It appears as though he's kind of mired in the politics and the vested interests that operate through the governing party.
Yeah. Do you mean by that, Prof, that these are political appointments? And I mean, it takes me to my next question to you. Will the president be making these decisions based on who's the best person for the job when he does announce his cabinet reshuffle? Or will it again be a case of loyalty and slate politics?
Well, we'll soon see. I think that the question is whether he's got any people to choose from. But the way I would see it is in terms of political choices, I'd call them, is he going to avoid the patronage choices? Is he going to avoid the people who are essentially part of the problem? Or is he going to select people who are highly competent, who are not part of the problem of patronage and corruption within the state? And so rewarding loyalty is very often a recipe for the selection of ministers who really aren't fit for purpose. So we really need a complete rethink. I'm not sure whether he's got the time or the scope to do that. But if he doesn't do it, there's going to be a severe impact on South Africa, because at this point in time, we are not looking good economically. It is showing up in all of the indicators as indicators of failure in South Africa. And if they are not addressed, and I'll just give one, infrastructure is so important in South Africa. But the question is, can we actually drive an infrastructure project that doesn't have between 30 to 60% corruption involved in it? And that's the reason why those projects are delayed and why people who shouldn't be running those projects are selected. So our infrastructure is failing because of potential manipulation of tenders, etc., instead of actually spending the billions we have available for this to actually deal with our infrastructure. And that's a contributor to growth. And essentially, we're spending billions, wasting billions, and getting nothing done. Now, that goes right up to the top. Are the vested interests that operate through the governing party going to be addressed in this reshuffle, or is he going to accommodate them? If he accommodates them, we're basically just going to see a continuous decline from where we are.
And if we want to look for more examples, we don't have to look very far in terms of just how much trouble we're in, Professor van Heever. The grey listing of South Africa, was it just on Friday? It's another indicator of the state that we're in.
So that potential Moody's downgrades, etc. People can moan about whether or not these are maneuverings internationally, etc. But when you kind of look at the reasons for doing these things, they're basically looking at all the stuff we're experiencing. Infrastructure failing. Our public transport system has collapsed and it hasn't recovered since COVID. And it appears as though the Minister of Transport, and this is now a very, very critical appointment, the Minister of Transport has been completely incapable of addressing South Africa's transport needs. He appears monotonously on television as pretending to be delivering things, and nothing changes. It just gets worse. We've got our rail system, which was developed in the 1900s. It's collapsed. Our public transport system is crucial to our functioning as an economy. That's just one arm. Energy obviously has collapsed and is in serious difficulties. So we can't have these people who have no idea what they're doing in charge of such critical portfolios. That needs to be addressed. But I think that the reason it's not addressed is because there's substantial patronage involved. And the question is really whether the governing party is in a position to challenge those vested interests or to pacify and accommodate them. And it appears as though the latter is potentially the way we're going at the moment. You're
talking about Fikile Mbalula, the Minister of Transport, who is also sort of in line for a reshuffle, his position that is, after his appointment as Secretary General of the ANC. I want to just link Fikile Mbalula's comments in the wake of Andre de Ruyter's bombshell interview over several issues insofar as Eskom is concerned, but in particular the involvement of a minister, or at least a minister with real knowledge of the extent of the rot at Eskom. What did you make of Fikile Mbalula's response to that?
extraordinary. And coming from a person who has failed to deliver so consistently over the past few years in his portfolio, to attack the rater in the way that he has, as well as to attack him on the accusations of corruption, which the rater has reported. So the part of the frustration that I saw in that interview, and now in my involvement and knowledge of people within government, is that the rater's experience is by no means unique. Is that you try and get things followed up. You become the target when you start to do that. So the more serious the person is at the top who's attempting to change things, the shorter their stay. And their lives are at risk. This is what we see becoming the trend. So when we see him being attacked when he raises these issues, instead of saying, wow, that's a real problem we've got to address, it really worries me, because it suggests that people like Fikile and Balula are perfectly aware of what's going on, but the last thing they want is for anybody to talk about it.
In general, the response to what Andre de Ruyter had to say was bizarre, wasn't it, Prof? And it's exactly what you say. Instead of real shock, instead of a promise from government that they are concerned about what the outgoing CEO of the power utility has to say, and that there will be real investigations and a real attempt to get to the bottom of it. We've seen the opposite.
And I think that this is common. And I'll give you another example. The Babita Deokaran murder, as well as the investigation into the corruption at Tembisa Hospital. What you see at the moment, if you read the Sunday papers, is that at this point in time, the President has still not signed the proclamation for the SIU to investigate. So they're waiting. Why? It was 2021 that the murder took place, and she flagged massive corruption. The senior officials have not been fired or disciplined, let alone properly investigated. So what is actually going on there? So the point there, the example is, when somebody actually identifies corruption going on, they're the ones that are removed, they're the ones that are assassinated. We see that de Ruyter, there was an attempted assassination in his case, and I know of many others in senior positions in provincial departments where they've attempted to directly take on vested interests. And instead of getting political support for what they're doing, they're very often targeted. So this, to me, is a real concern, is that basically, put it in simple language, the good guys are driven out, and the bad guys are the ones that remain. Either the bad guys or the ones who basically will not offend anybody, will just kind of keep their heads down and look away.
Yep.
And that becomes our state. So we actually need an inversion of this relationship. We need to basically have the good guys at the top and the bad guys kicked out. Our system is not doing that at the moment, and so we see it, and we're seeing the consequences all around us.
Yeah, those senior officials that you talk about being suspended with full pay to this day. Professor Alex van den Heever, let me thank you for your time this morning as we unpack the imminent cabinet reshuffle, and we've been saying imminent for quite some time now. The President apparently having spoken with alliance partners, and we are according to reports, expecting that announcement to be made soon.